Hey art nerds! Today we're going to do a marker tutorial using Strathmore toned tan paper and the materials you see here. And this is the piece that we're going to create. I do want to say that I began this piece with a red lead underdrawing, as you guys can see right here. And the point of using toned tan paper is that the toned tan provides a mid-tone, so you don't have to use as many colors, nor do you have to do as much blending because you already have that mid-tone on the paper. So when I swatched my colors, I started a little bit darker than I normally would because I was thinking about using the paper as a mid-tone from the get-go. You also want to leave opportunities for the paper color to shine through with your illustration. That creates a more integrated piece. So I colored the blues of her eyes, and now I'm filling in the yellow on these black-eyed Susans. And you guys can see I colored it through the bow because these bows are going to be transparent purple. And one of the ways you can create the illusion of transparency is by coloring through something. And I did the same thing for the sleeves on her dress as well. For a list of the colors used in this tutorial, make sure you check out the description below. And I use Blick and Copic markers pretty interchangeably. I find that they work well together. I really enjoy using Strathmore toned tan paper. This is the toned tan drawing paper, but they also make a mixed media paper. It accepts markers, color pencil quite well, and the mixed media paper can take watercolor as well. So now I am applying what would normally be the mid-tone for Kara's skin, but again we are using the toned tan as our base color. So you guys will note that I'm not coloring every part of her face. Also, keep in mind that when you apply color, particularly watercolor or alcohol markers to toned tan paper, it appears darker at first and then dries lighter. That's why it's really helpful to do swatches, as you can see on the left-hand side on this paper. Now I'm applying the first layer of blush color to her cheeks, the tops of her eyelids, her inner ear, below her nose, on her lips, and beneath her neck. And since her sleeves are transparent, I applied the base color of her skin so that it will appear transparent as we add additional colors. And don't worry about getting a clean application. As you apply other layers of alcohol ink, it's going to blend it out. So now we're applying our first layer of purple, and this is a periwinkle blue-violet sort of purple. And I color right on top of the yellow that I'd applied for the flowers. And I do the same for the bow at the top. Next, I apply a darker layer of shading to her blush. So I think that's like rose or flesh tint. And then I begin coloring in her eyes using a light orange, or not a light orange, but like an orangey brown. With alcohol markers, if you wait for them to dry, you can get a sharp transition. If you apply them while the prior color is still damp, you'll get a smoother blend. So I allowed this layer to dry before applying the next layer because I did want that transition in color. Now I'm applying shadows to her skin using, I believe, sand. Now normally sand is too dark for Kara's skin if we were using white paper, but since we're using toned tan paper, it's important to adjust our colors a little bit. And note, I don't apply shadow on the areas of her skin that are going to be covered by the sleeves. I want to give the illusion of transparency, and if I render that too much, it's going to appear completely transparent. Like there was nothing actually in front of the skin. Adding a little bit of shading to our flowers. And that is a Copic sketch that I filled with Ranger Sunshine Yellow. So if there are colors that you like in other brands, like in Ranger, Pinata, or Kurosaki, you can always purchase empty Copic sketch markers and fill them yourself. You can also do custom mixes if you wish. Now I'm adding a little bit of shading to the skin using a blue-violet. And I ended up finding that this blue-violet wasn't quite dark enough, so later on I use a darker blue-violet. When you're coloring on tone paper, remember to adjust your tones to about a shade darker than you would normally go for. The beads on her neck are also transparent. I'd applied a little bit of skin tone to the center, and then I went over it with yellow, leaving just a rim of the tone tan paper at the top. And that would probably be my third layer of color with blue-violet periwinkle from Blick. So you can really get a lot of use out of just one color. Sort of adding the center striations to the Black-Eyed Susans. And coloring in the sleeves of her dress using a very light blue-violet. If you're coloring in something that's supposed to look like transparent white, you can use one of the very light blues like B00, B00, or B01 depending on the paper you're using. Now I found that her blush wasn't dark enough, so I grabbed a much darker blush tone, and now I'm filling in the center of the Black-Eyed Susans with a very dark brown, trying to leave just hints of the tone tan paper visible through. And as you can see on the bow, I add a little bit of that dark brown just visible through the bow as well. If you find your blue-violet is a little bit too intense, you can knock it back using a skin tone. So I was using suntan there just to kind of blend the transition between shading on skin and the skin itself. Now I'm adding the first level of freckles using Oriental. Now on white papers it's usually dark enough, but I decided to go in with a darker brown just to add a few darker freckles here and there, including through the sleeves. So when you're rendering transparent objects, think about it as sort of adding a filter. It's a filter that you see the object through. So some details will be obscured and some details will still be apparent. And it's up to you to decide which you want to keep and which you want to lose. Now I'm using a much darker mustardy yellow to add details to the yellow beads as well as to the centers of the flowers. And you could go lineless with this style, that's why we use the red lead. I do opt to line it later on, but what's really nice about using colored leads for your underdrawings is that you always have the option to do lineless marker pieces, and I have several tutorials on this channel for how you can do just that. Now I use my darkest brown just to add some shading, some shadows, some lowlights to my Black-Eyed Susans. Now I'm going to start rendering the hair, and I want her hair to appear really glossy, so I sketch in the highlights first. And when I draw and render hair, I think of it as discrete chunks, discrete blocks, rather than individual strands. I find this cartoony approach to drawing hair to be much easier than trying to render individual strands. I just don't have the patience, I guess. Now that the base layer has been applied and dried, I'm adding a secondary layer of brown. And the point is, when you add layers, whether it's to watercolor or to alcohol markers, you're always wanting to render less than you did in the prior level, in the prior layer. So you're building up layers, but you're not completely covering up the past layer. And you guys could see that I also drew her hair visible through the bow as well. Now, after I'd done that second layer of highlight or coloring, I decided that I wasn't really happy with my highlights, so I adjusted them slightly. Now I'm using my darkest brown to kind of add the darkest shadows to her hair, and I want to keep that kind of light. Alright, so I basically finished markering. Now I am inking with the Copic Drawing Pen. Now this is a pen that is Copic proof, so you could ink it before markering it, but I like sort of adding ink details here and there rather than creating an ink line art. I mean, I do work both ways, but for this piece I thought adding the ink details later on would be better. And I wish I'd used a sepia or a brown fine liner for this, because it really would have added a lot. I feel like inking with the black pen kind of deadened the piece. I'm also just not particularly impressed by this drawing pen. I received it in an Art Snacks unboxing, and it is not as flexible as a fountain pen that I would use to ink pieces would normally be. Normally I would grab for noodlers. This one is a little bit of a dead nail. So it's also not waterproof, which kind of limits its use for me since Copic multi-liners are waterproof, but I thought it would be neat to demonstrate it for this piece. So I mostly focus on lining her face, so features that would otherwise get lost, and then lining the shadows. My intention isn't to line the entire thing. And using black ink does add a lot of contrast to the piece, so sometimes pieces that are not quite working just need to be inked. And you may hear of this sort of line art referred to as hide and seek lines or stop and go lines because it isn't a continuous line around the object. You are leaving the areas closest to your light source or closest to the top still uninked. And this creates the illusion of lighting, and it also gives an impression of airiness. Heavy objects generally tend to have heavier line art. Lighter objects tend to have lighter objects. So think line art. So think about how you might ink an anvil as compared to how you might ink a feather. I do believe these drawing pins from Copic are available in other colors. I just happen to have a black one. And I recommend you twist and turn your paper like I'm doing in order to get the best angle for inking. Normally I would also do that when I am doing alcohol marker coloring or even watercolor. You always want to work with your wrist rather than work against your wrist. I do know that when I'm twisting and turning the paper though, it can be a little bit hard for you guys to see what I'm doing. So I try to limit that when I'm recording myself doing marker and watercolor tutorials for you guys. But since mistakes in inking can quickly become apparent and sometimes can ruin a piece, I do try to do what's best for my art and what's best for my wrist when I am inking. You'll note I am not inking the objects that are appearing through the transparent objects. So say the flowers, for example, I don't ink the part of the flower that is obscured by the bow. That would kind of break the illusion of transparency because it would make the object that I've inked appear too solid rather than it's obscured by a screen. What's your preference? Do you prefer alcohol markers? Do you prefer water-based markers, watercolor markers, or even watercolor? If you had to pick a favorite, let me know in the comments below. I know that's a hard choice. As I ask that question, I don't know if I can answer it either. So next, I am tweaking a few things, adding a little bit more alcohol marker just to darken up certain areas since inking it has changed the contrast a bit. And what's nice about this pen is it is Copic marker proof, so I am able to do this. And then I'm creating a bit of a blue background that she rests on. So I guess I'm casting some shadows using a very light blue. And that just helps her feel, or helps the piece feel like it's not just something sitting on top of the paper, but part of the paper itself. And you can do this with any light color just to add a little bit of cast shadow. It can also be used for atmospheric lighting. So next, I'm going to try to add some white highlights. In the past, I used to love to use the Winsor & Newton pigment markers, the white ones, to build up sort of white shadows. This one is dying, so it's time to toss it and replace it. I ended up using the bullet nib because that's the one that was getting any juice. But what I like about this is that you can gradually lighten the color, which makes it really fun to use on toned tan paper. Think of it a bit like sculpting. You are creating shadows and highlights. So next I switch over to the Kurosaki white pigment brush pen that I picked up while I was in Japan. This one's a little bit finicky to use. In order for me to get this thing started, since it's so prone to clogging, I end up having to squeeze it until it starts leaking, and then I have to dip in the leaked out ink in order to have something to work with. What's nice though is it's capable of variable line weights and has a very flexible tip. I believe you can find these in the US now. Now I'm going to use a white color pencil to add even more white and to help build up more contrast. Normally my preference would be to use the white Winsor & Newton marker for this, but a white color pencil will work just fine. This is an inexpensive one I picked up from Utrecht several years ago. finally, I'm just going to add a few white details here and there using a white Unisigno gel pen. And a white Recollections marker picked up from Michael's. These things are great too, especially for use on toned papers. They can be an easy way to lighten up areas that have gotten too dark or add a little bit more white back to the piece. Alright, so that is our finished marker illustration on Strathmore Tone Tan paper. We used alcohol markers, we used a Copic fountain pen, and we used several white art supplies in order to make this happen. Thank you guys.